Thank you.
Great. Well, welcome everybody, whatever time of day or evening it is with you, where you're joining us from. And it's a great pleasure for me to introduce, or more correctly, reintroduce to the forum, Professor Ori Soltes. He has, it's a particular pleasure because he chaired a seminar that I did earlier this year on a related theme. Professor Soltes teaches at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. across a range of disciplines, from art history and theology to philosophy and political history. He's the former director of the B'nai B'rith Plutznik National Jewish Museum, where he co-founded the Holocaust Art Restitution Project. He's curated more than 90 exhibitions across the world and authored or edited many books and several hundred articles and essays. And his recent volumes include Mysticism in Judaism, Christianity and Islam, Searching for Oneness, Tradition and Transformation, 3 Millennia of Jewish Art and Architecture, and Growing Up Jewish in India. And today he's going to speak to us about the topic of another of his books, Sacred Signs: How Jewish, Christian and Muslim Visual Symbols Draw from the Same Well. I'm really looking forward to hearing this, as I'm sure we all are. So welcome, Professor Soltes.
Thank you, Joanna, and thank you, Thea. It's a pleasure, of course, to be with you all. As you said, whatever time of day or night it happens to be for you. And I want to begin my conversation by throwing out a few comments that pertain to art and how one finds it across history, not just within the Abrahamic traditions, but those that precede and those that are outside them. So comment one is that art has spent most of human history and geography as an instrument in the hands of religion to help religion do what religion does. Religion is that which addresses a reality beyond ourselves, which humans have always and across all cultures and civilizations believed exists and has had something to do with our coming into existence, and therefore has the capacity, both positive or negative, having created it can destroy. It can help us, it can harm us, it can hinder us, it can further us, it can bless us, it can curse us. The point and purpose of religion is to see that we're blessed, not cursed, helped, not harmed, furthered, not hindered, created, not destroyed. And while an instrument, and perhaps the primary human instrument for doing this, is the word, because we are verbal in a way that other species are not, words all too often fall too short. And so we have, across our long history as a species, used other instruments as well, of which the visual arts is just one. But the visual arts and religion have also had a long intersection with politics, because so often religion is the servant of politics. If I want to assert or maintain a political position, it may well be the case that I do so by reference to divinity as the justification for my position, and as a warning to you not to oppose me on the grounds that you'll also be opposing divinity. So there's a kind of trinity, so to say, of art, religion, and politics, and one might add a fourth leg to mix my metaphors, a fourth leg to that table, economics, because those who can afford to sponsor the art that does the job I just briefly described will do so. A second general point is that because art, when it serves religious purposes, is addressing a reality beyond ourselves, more often than not, it can't do so directly. And so it does so indirectly. And that's where the word symbols comes in. Symbols is a Greek word, symbalon, from the verb symbalein, which literally means to throw with or to throw together. It's something standing for something else, and typically it will be something concrete that stands in lieu of something abstract, so as to justify it. There's a wonderful scene in the Iliad where one of the Achaeans and one of the Trojans suddenly realize they recognize each other, so they shouldn't fight because they each have plenty of people on the other side to fight and kill if they're lucky. Instead, they exchange gifts so as to suggest that even in the midst of war, these two individuals can exhibit friendship. But the point is that those gifts are called symbola because they stand for this abstraction of friendship, of peace within the context of war. So that's what symbols do. They function through indirection. And a third general principle is that over the course of art history and across art geography, art operates again and again by way of transformation. So a particular visual idea will be re-expressed in a slightly different sort of way. And we can see all of this operating from antiquity right up to the present day. And at this point, I'm going to share a screen, hopefully with effectiveness. Can you see this image? Does someone tell me yes?
Yes, it's coming.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. I'm going to enlarge it, which will digitalize it so it won't look as good, but you'll be able to see it a little bit better. This is the Venus of Willendorf. She dates from nearly 20,000 years ago. She was found near Willendorf, Austria, and she's called Venus because Venus in pre-classical period was a fertility goddess. She becomes this playmate centerfold when we get to the classical Greeks and the Romans. And of course, the Greeks call her Aphrodite anyway, but the Romans called her Venus. So the point is she's called the Venus of Willendorf because she's understood to represent, she is a symbol of a concrete expression of the abstraction fertility. Without fertility, we do not survive. If we're not fertile, we die out. If our fields aren't fertile, we die. If our animals aren't fertile, we die. So fertility is essential to survival and therefore connects by definition to religion, the point and purpose fundamentally of which is survival. So we see this tiny figure, she's less than 6 inches high, and she's got enormous breasts, enormous belly, enormous umbilicus. It's digitalized. Trust me, her pubic area is very well defined, thick thighs, all of these elements that connote fertility, skinny little arms that do nothing but stretch themselves across the breasts to further emphasize them, no face, a head that consists entirely of rows of curls that look almost like rows of a plowed field, but more to the point, there's 7 of them. And much, much, much later on, when we can read what is written in antiquity, we understand that 7 is associated with divinity, it's associated with perfection, it's associated with completeness. So everything about this tiny little figure stands for our connection in an appropriate manner with divinity through which we survive in a number of different ways. By contrast, the most common symbol for male fertility is the bull or its earlier avatar, the bison. And I'm just giving you a detail here from one of those early cave paintings, in this case from Lascaux. So even further back than the Venus of Willendorf comes from. And you can see the artist has portrayed again and again these powerful bulls or occasionally deer. What's this all about? On the one hand, the bull is not just a symbol of fertility because, well, he's powerful, he's virile. But if any of you has ever grown up on a farm, you know that in the spring, farmers with cows from all around will bring those cows to the farmer who's got a bull because the bull is a virtuoso of fertility. They just can keep going on and on and on and on. Obviously, this is not something that just emerged in recent years. The deer, because another way in which we survive, of course, is when our hunters go out to hunt. And if you imagine that this cave down away from the everyday reality of the earth, the art, I can almost guarantee, done at night, not during the every time of day, by a priest who is an artist who is a priest, is making contact to that other reality, which is the reality not of day but of night, not of life but of death, not of the earth but above or below the earth, that of divinity, so that they will hopefully be reminded when our brother hunter goes out into that other reality to hunt, to provide him with deer, and the bulls speak for themselves. But the idea can transform itself. We fast forward to roughly 1500 BCE, and the city of Knossos on northern Crete, the Minoan city, And it's an area known for the repeated image of the double axe, what in Greek is called labaros. So it's called the labyrinthos, the place of the double axe. But the point about the double axe is it's stylized symbols of the upraised bull horns. And had I more time to spend just on this detail, I could show you a whole range of images that would suggest how clearly that is part of the intention. It's held to either side of a central element, a kind of pillar, you might say, transformation. We fast forward a few centuries to about 1250 BC or so, up to the mainland, to Mycenae, where the entryway to this great palace complex that is associated with Agamemnon by tradition in any case, is marked by a protective element over the doorway, a pair of lions. The heads are on dowels. They've long been lost, so we can't see them, but they're looking out at us, and they stand to either side of a column which has stylized vegetation. The column is a stand-in for a tree. So another transformation. And why? How do I know it's a stand-in for a tree? Because there are many, many, many images. This is one of them. This is from 15 centuries earlier than that. It's from Sumer in southern what is now Iraq, where we see a tree which is understood to be the tree of life. And we have Sumerian literature. We know that garden, it's called Dilmun, where that tree of life it grows. We, in fact, have an avatar of that that appears in the book of Genesis, as you all know. So to either side of that tree, we have once again a pair of wild, woolly animals who are, first of all, to either side disposed like the pair of lions we just saw a moment ago. But second of all, in being thusly disposed in such a calm, symmetrical way, they are ordered. So the whole composition also represents the very idea of order as opposed to chaos. The tree becomes a column in one context. In a different context, it becomes a person, or rather not just any person, but the kind of person that we see here on the faceboard of a harp found in the grave of Queen Sarishwabi in Sumer. It's Gilgamesh, the fifth king, who was the hero, who was the one who went to Dilmun and tried to bring back the flower of immortality, but of course he failed. But we see him here in his capacity as the master of the beasts who orders reality by standing like the column, like the tree, flanked left and right, except in this case, he's actually holding them under his control, these wild bulls. So we've gone from bulls to lions to wild mountain goats. We've gone from trees to columns to heroic characters. And this is just a bit of the kind of transformative possibilities that a symbolic vocabulary offers to us. Politics. Gilgamesh is, after all, not only understood to have been the quintessential hero, but he's in the king's list. We know him as a king, and as a king, he has, as it were, a foot in two worlds, one in our world, one in the world of the gods that you and I don't. Nowhere do we see that more emphatic than in the context of Egypt. Over the long history of ancient Egypt, between in round numbers, 3000 BC and about the time of Jesus, the Pharaoh has at various times under various circumstances understood at most to be God itself incarnate, or at least to be operating with the imprimatur of the gods behind him. We're looking here at a image of the Pharaoh Khafra from the 25th pre-Christian century, from the 4th dynasty. He's the one of the three great pyramids in Giza is associated with him. And I'm showing you the side view because aside from the absolutely perfect, every detail, regularity of his features that connote a kind of eternal, unchanging divine quality and not the irregularities that we humans possess, but more emphatically, you can see that there is a hawk falcon behind his head with its wings spread protectively around the back of his neck. Every Egyptian would understand that that's a stand-in, a symbol of the god Horus. Everyone understands that the statement that is being made here is, I rule with the imprimatur of Horus. In fact, in some contexts, the pharaoh would be considered the embodiment of Horus, but minimally, I rule with that divine imprimatur, and of course, the favor or the grace of Horus literally rests on me. Not an Egyptian, because that, for our purposes, doesn't matter. But in Greek, the word for favor or grace, as you all know, is charis, this is what true charisma is. This is truly what it means to be charismatic. He's got the God resting upon him. So what happens if we fast forward into the post-pagan ancient world of Christianity? And I start with Christianity because it's perhaps the most familiar to most people with respect to art. And I look here at the side of a sarcophagus, a structure that by definition intermediates between life and death, this world and the next, from about the 5th century. This is from the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul. And we see another transformation on a number of levels. First of all, of that 3-figure composition that we saw demonstrated 3 or 4 times a few moments ago. But second of all, what are the components that make up these 3 figures? We have in the center, well, it's the tree of life, only in a different way. It's the stylized rendition of the chai rho, the XR, that are the first 2 letters of the word Christos. So it's a stand-in for Jesus, surrounded by a wreath, which first of all, in being a circle, is a symbol of perfection without beginning, without end, and therefore a symbol of divinity. But second of all, you can see it's not just a circle, it's a wreath, which means it's got fertility, it's got vegetation, another symbol and symptom of survival. We're all the way back with the Venus of Willendorf, but in a completely different language, in a completely different dialect, and yet that same interest is there. This element is flanked left and right by what you and I would say, oh, it's a pair of angels. Had I time, which I don't, I would have shown you the idea of victory, which for the Greeks becomes this allegorical female landing on the top of a column, which the Romans transformed into a pair of relief carved figures with wings, with robes flowing, usually to either side of the empty space in the winches of an arch. So you think of the Arch of Titus, you think of the Arch of Constantine, you think of the Arch of Septimius Severus, and those are just 3 in Rome itself. You've got these victory figures, Nike in Greek, Victoria in Latin, that have been reused but transformed for Christian thinking into images of angels, but they are victory figures. Isn't this all about the victory of life over death, the central element of which is a symbol of Jesus, the tree of life, flanked left and right by these intermediating beings? Transformation. This is another sarcophagus from Ravenna, maybe a little bit later. It's more or less the same time, though, late 5th, early 6th century. And here you see that the central element is a fountain. Well, of course, you can't survive without water. So the fountain of water instead of the tree of life, instead of the column that represents the tree, instead of the hero king who represents the tree, it's a fountain flanked left and right, not by lions, not by angels, not by wild mountain goats, not by bulls, but by a pair of, if you look carefully, they are peacocks. And of course, the peacock is a multi-level Christian symbol. The eyes of the all-seeing church account for the eyes on the tail of the peacock. The peacock is associated with Hera or Juno, the queen of heaven in the Greco-Roman pagan tradition. The Virgin Mary, in one of her aspects, is the queen of heaven. The peacock, going back to the Egyptian tradition, is thought of as a creature whose animal, when he dies, doesn't rot. So it becomes a symbol somehow of immortality. And so that's what it is here, life after death. And finally, the peacock cry, if you've heard peacocks, is really weird. And in the early Christian period, the peacocks were thought of as sounding like the cries of martyrs who were being tortured. So on several different levels, the peacock here, out of its identity as a pagan, become a definitively Christian symbol, composed, as we have seen a number of other compositions up to this point. Of course, the cross eventually becomes the quintessential symbol of Jesus, not the chairo, not the wreath, not many other symbols that one finds in the catacombs. It becomes the cross, and this is just one example. It's a very large cross from the 8th century, the Ahene cross. It's about 11 feet high, and from near Tipperary in Ireland. And I call your attention just to 4 things. One, the cross is inherently a symbol of Jesus, not just because of the idea of the crucifixion, but look at its configuration. The horizontal and the vertical is a stand-in for, a symbolon for, divine and human, heaven and earth. This cross, on the other hand, in being a stop-start rectilinear four-directional kind of element, represents our reality over and against the circle around it, which is without stop-starts, without beginning, without end, as I've already said, a symbol of divinity. Then, of course, in this particular case, we have these five little bulbs that clearly represent the five wounds into Christ's body. And finally, notice how the patterns, which are Celtic, are both, on the one hand, a symbol of us, in that they are minute over and against the monumental construction of the overall work of art in this case. But at the same time, by paradox, they symbolize God because they're infinitizing. These patterns could go on and on and on if they were not finitized by what represents you and me, which is to say, the borders or the frames that finitize them. Of course, the idea of the cross does not just lend itself to something I wear around my neck or something that is hanging in a field or something that is in some building, but the church itself into which I enter in being cruciform. And because the cross itself represents Christ, becomes an instrument through which I enter the body of Christ. So I don't just enter a church like I enter into my house, just throwing my shoes off and my coat off and in a kind of relaxed, namby-pamby manner. I do so and I exit as much as I enter in a proper kind of mode. I'm within it in a proper mode because I've entered into that realm that mediates between God and ourselves, which is symbolized consummately for Christianity by Christ, who mediates between God and ourselves. This happens to be Saint-Sernin in Toulouse, by the way, an important church along the pilgrim route to Santiago de Compostela. Obviously, all of this becomes even more emphatic, and in Christian art, it becomes possible because one of the features of Christianity that will distinguish it from Judaism and Islam is its embrace of the figurative, because God itself becomes figurative very specifically as Jesus of Nazareth. So at a certain point in time, we start to see not just crosses, but Jesus on the cross. Already that's happening by the 7th, 8th, 9th centuries. And even the style then of the representation of Christ's body will change. But for our purposes, what I want to point out to you, out of the zillion things that I could spend 4 hours in just looking at this image alone, which is the apse from the upper church of San Clemente in Rome, and the mosaics here date from the 13th century. What I want to point out is just a handful of things. Of course, Jesus on the cross. Of course, 12 doves that represent the apostles. Of course, two figures, it's the Virgin Mary and John the Evangelist, who gesture differently to him, intermediating therefore between what he is and who he is and ourselves. Look, ecce, behold, but notice they're not identical, because it's what later on the Italians will call contrapposto, what the ancient Greeks called symmetria, a dynamic balance of imbalance that we see. And we recognize, of course, at the bottom, the apostles again as a series of a dozen sheep, Jesus as the agnus, the lamb of God. I'll ignore for the moment the halo, I'll get to that later on. Two more things that I would call to your attention, 2.5 things. One, the cross is growing out of a plant. The plant is an acanthus. And acanthus doesn't wilt. It stays green through the winter. So it is a symbol of immortality, of eternal life. And we can see that all the way back to the Egyptians. They use the acanthus to signify that. They start to use it as one of the modes of creating the capital. The capitals on their columns. And of course, the Greeks picked that up. The Corinthian capital is an acanthus capital. By the time the Greeks are using it, it's just pretty. But for the Egyptians, it had meant immortality. It has come back to that role here. It is that tree of life. So it's not just the cross as the tree of life, but it's a tree of life growing from a tree of life. And of course, this acanthus has been spreading throughout the entire apse. And at the base, we see, first of all, a pair of animals, symmetria, contrapposto, perfect balance, taking us all the way back to the early images I showed you, drinking left and right from what? From a river that is the river of paradise, but you'll notice that it's got 4 streams. What are the 4 streams? They're the 4 Gospels, of course. So there is a whole language and an endless array of vocabulary parts of that language in this kind of an image. course, the other most common representation of Jesus, other than Jesus on the cross, is on his mom's lap. And so from about the same time period, this is also the 13th century. It's a Byzantine icon. It's here in Washington at the National Gallery of Art. We see him on his mother's lap. And again, there are many, many things to talk about. I'll just call your attention to a few things. One, they're in spaceless space. It's gold leaf. It's not a real space. Two, he doesn't look like a real baby. He looks like an adult. He's got an enlarged forehead because that's where the soul is. The eyes are the windows to the soul. Being who he is, he's got an extra piece of that thing that we all have called soul. Three, he gestures with the gesture that we understand to be benedictory. But if we look at pagan Roman statuary and read Pliny, we understand that that's the gesture that we learn in the law schools to make when we make a point. It's a rhetorical gesture. And benediction is a rhetorical gesture. I bless you. I forgive you. Whatever. If you remember the movie Schindler's List, you will remember that after the night when Schindler and Amon Goes, the head of the concentration camp, had been drinking together, and temporarily Schindler convinced Goes that it was much better to forgive people than to, because Goes would spend every morning shooting people. He comes out and he's practicing in front of the mirror, if you remember that scene, with this gesture. I forgive you. I forgive you. And it takes a little while before he goes back to shooting people. But the point is, it's a rhetorical gesture. The gestures are not accidental. It's not accidental that her fingers give us 1 and 3, the one God expressed by the Trinity. We see them in colors that are symbolic. This is green. I know it's washed out, but trust me, it is. The color of spring and rebirth. This is red, the color of blood and sacrifice. This is blue, the color of the sky and of divine truth. And there's white up here, the color of virgin purity. And both of them have around their heads that thing that you and I call a halo. It comes from the Greek word for sun, helios. And the idea of someone with a divine connection being marked in some way by kind of a sunburst or a starburst goes all the way back to Sumerian art. Only Jesus will have a halo marked, however, by this cruciform here, that on the one hand, as you can see, because we have 3 visible wings, connotes the Trinity. But on the other hand, if his head weren't in the way, we realize it's the whole crucifix. So it's also connoting the self-sacrifice that he's going to make some 30 years down the road. If we jump from the 13th century to the early 16th century, and one of these wonderful Virgin and Child paintings by Raphael, we recognize on the one hand, that stylistically, we've undergone a radical change. We have a real plump, juicy baby with his fat little tushy and the skin of his back kind of being pushed in by his mother's hand, who is cheek to cheek with his mom. He's a real Umbrian baby. She's a real Umbrian mommy. And they're in a real atmosphere with landscape elements and sky. Because when we get to the Renaissance, there's an interest in emphasizing the human quality of Jesus. That's part of the reason for the word humanism. Whereas the Byzantine artist, the anonymous Byzantine artist of 300 years earlier, was emphasizing the divine connection of Jesus and his mother. And we see that they both have halos, but they're barely discernible. And there are Raphael paintings where there are no halos. We don't need halos. We know who this guy is. So it's a different stylistic direction, but with some of the same key symbolic ideas. If we look at this image, which is from the late 12th century, it's about 1182, it's from Sicily. Here we see the king, Guillermo II, William II, in a mosaic in a small chapel that he has sponsored, where you can see he's making the same sort of gesture that was being made by John, the evangelist, in the mosaic in San Clemente. But there's another nuance to it. It's not just behold, see Christ on his throne. It's also behold, see what the man who says, ego sum lux mundi, I am the light of the world, who has that halo, who has that otherworldly look what he's doing. His hand is resting on my crown, ladies and gentlemen. I rule by divine imprimatur. This is the same idea as we saw with Khafra and the Horus. This is Guillermo or William and Jesus. One more Christian image. Fast forward to the 17th century, a time period in which the Church of Rome, with its center in Rome, is in a long, enduring struggle with the fallaway churches of the various Protestant denominations, and the Church of St. Peter's, which has been in development since the late 15th century. We've carried it at this point to the early 17th century. And what we're looking at here is a wonderful work by Bernini from the Baldachin from about 1623 to 34. The baldachin marks the meeting of the apse and the nave on the one hand and the transepts on the other, so the two angles of the cross. It hovers over what is below this church, which is supposed to be the grave of St. Peter himself. And so it marks a place where originally, back in the 4th century, a church of St. Peter had been built by Constantine and his mother, St. Helen, who had visited Jerusalem and brought back two things. One, the remains of the true cross, which she uncovered 250 years after the crucifixion, and the remains of the columns that had once stood before the temple that had been destroyed back in the year 70, and this is around the year 320 or so. And the Christian tradition has it that those columns were twisted. So the old church of St. Peter, which had the pair of columns in front of it, is torn down by the end of the 15th century. A new church is being built. By the middle of the 17th century, Bernini creates this baldachin, and I call your attention to two things about it. One is that the columns are twisted. That is an allusion to the old St. Peter's. The other thing I want to call to your attention are the bees that you can see all over the columns and the upper parts of the baldachin, which are the symbol of the Barberini family. It's the Barberini bee, and Urban VIII, the Pope who commissioned this, therefore is making also a kind of political statement about the presence of his family in this process of revitalizing St. Peter's. If we switch gears and look to Jewish art, Judaism, like Christianity, is emerging out of the Israelite Judean tradition in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And what becomes, ironically enough, the earliest and most enduring symbol in Jewish art is the 7-branched candelabrum, the first bona fide apparition of which is on the underside of the Arch of Titus. Titus was the dude who destroyed the temple in the year 70. He subsequently became emperor after his father Vespasian, and when he died, his younger brother Domitian became emperor and created this arch to honor the memory of his brother. And so we see the carrying of the temple menorah into Rome, always symbolized by an arch, at the time of the destruction, to signify his great accomplishment at bringing to an end the Judean revolt. Here is a close-up. You're not seeing the whole thing, but you can get enough of it to get an idea of the menorah. And I would make several comments about it. Comment one, it will become, for Jewish art, a reminder of the destroyed temple and the hope for its rebuilding in the Messianic future. It will also be connected back to that idea of sevenness that I mentioned early on with the Venus of Willendorf, not only with the idea of divinity, the perfection, completion, all of that, but of course connected to the creation cycle that culminates with the 7th day of rest, which is then in turn connected in the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy to the commandment to keep the Sabbath, to keep the 7th day as a day of rest. Even as Israel has kept the Sabbath has kept Israel. It's part of a covenantal reminder, responsibility, promise. All of that is connoted by the sevenness of the menorah. And I would point out that in this particular case, I think we have it as it might have looked like. We've got the frond motif, which we can identify as particular to Achaemenid furniture style, and it's under the Achaemenids. The Judeans came back and rebuilt the temple after the destruction of the first. And we've got at the base, which I suspect was added by Herod in his gussying up of the temple, its environments. You can see that these are the zodiac symbols, but there are 12 of them. They stand for the 12 tribes of Israel in a kind of symbolic language. And so we see the menorah again and again and again. This is a 5th century. It's a piece from a synagogue in the northern Galilee. We understand the menorah here is where we have seen the tree of life before, and it is a tree form. It is a symbol of the tree of life, flanked in this case by ewers of water, other symbols of life. On the other hand, we can see in a Galilean mosaic synagogue floor of the early 6th century that the menorah itself is what flanks left and right, what is the center, which is the Holy of Holies in the temple, with the curtain, the parochet, hanging before it, and the pair of columns before the temple, Yachin and Boaz, represented, in fact, both before the stylized temple and before the Holy of Holies within it. And we can follow fast forward all the way to the late 18th century. This is from a synagogue in South Germany from 1772. And it's a parochet. We use the same term. The hanging before the Holy Ark where the Torah scrolls are kept is called by the same term that was used to refer to the hanging before the Holy of Holies in the temple. So that aspect of every synagogue, wherever across the planet Jews are found in building synagogues, connects them back by way of this kind of terminology to the temple in Jerusalem, the destroyed temple of the past, the hoped-for rebuilt messianic temple of the future. We have our friend the menorah again in the center, flanked in this way, in this case by a pair of columns, but notice the columns are twisted. So Bernini is so renowned as an architect, a sculptor, a painter, that after the mid-17th century, most often, not just in Christian contexts, but in Jewish contexts, you have the columns twisted that follows that Christian idea that the columns of the temple had been twisted, wrapped around with vines. If this were a Christian object, I'd say, well, of course, it's a Christ symbol. He's the good vintner. His blood is wine. His wine is blood. But it's a Jewish entity. But of course, in the Jewish tradition, Israel is likened to a vineyard in Isaiah 5, in Hosea 10, in Psalm 80, and a number of other places. So that symbol of the vineyard, of course, can do double duty. It depends on the particular object. Again, getting even closer to the Torah itself, which is a kind of stand-in for the high priest in the temple, the Torah, that it moves around the congregation the way the high priest once moved around the precincts of the temple, that bears the words of God from Genesis through Deuteronomy, that ends up decorated because the word itself cannot be decorated because of discomfort with visual imagery. So the Torah itself is not, but everything around it is. So here we're seeing a Torah shield, and the shield has, our friends, those columns, which again are twisted. But here's the thing. There is, however discomforted, however uncomfortable the Jewish tradition is understood to be with figurative art, there are times and places where figurative art is richly found. This is a synagogue from the 250s, from Duyaropis, on the border between the Roman and the Parthian becoming Sasanian empires. And this is one of two wall paintings that gives us an image of the temple, which looks very much like a Roman temple. This is, after all, nearly 2 centuries after the temple had been destroyed. We see oddly the parochet kind of there, but separating so we can see the Holy of Holies. We see our friend the menorah, surprise. We see 3 sacrificial animals. It very much connotes the kind of sacrifice that the Romans engaged in annually. And we see the high priest, who is Aaron. His name is given to us in Greek, but he's wearing what we can identify from the Avesta as a Zoroastrian priest's kind of outer garment, just as all of the attendants, both those for the sacrifice and those who were making the temple music, are wearing a combination of what we might think of in part as Roman, but certainly look at those pajama bottoms right out of the Persian vocabulary. And finally, of course, we have this fragment of wall, oddly, with its 3 doorways. Again, if I could just take this out and say, oh, Christian, I'd say, of course, a church, 3 doorways, symbol of the Trinity, absolutely. But the early synagogues had 3 doorways so as to symbolize the high priestly family, the Kohens, the priestly tribe, the Levites, the rest of Jews called Israel, but also in that very important Talmudic tractate called the Sayings of the Fathers, the Pirkei Avot, you have 2 different renditions of the following phrase: on 3 things the world doth stand. One version is Torah, service and acts of human kindness. Another version is judgment, Torah, and peace. The point is 3s becoming very important. And I might add finally that the temple had 3 courtyards and its interior was divided into 3 parts. So 3ness also plays that role here, conveying in 2 dimensions what you can't really convey as 3. Figures. Where's the last place I would expect to see figurative art in a Jewish context? on something like a Torah shield. And yet you can see that aside from the Decalogue that is a stand-in for the Torah, the pair of columns that are from the temple, the crown that doubles as the crown of the Torah and the Davidic messianic crown, I have Moses and Aaron quite figuratively represented, so that it is not the case that you never have figurative representation in the Jewish tradition. Here you have a pair of hands, and the hands are, we can read the inscription. This is from Morocco, the very end of the 19th, early 20th century. Sorry, not Morocco, Egypt. And we see it's the high priestly benediction. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and so on and so forth. But the hands are spread just evenly rather than in the traditional form for that. The menorah within the name of God, YHVH, Yahweh, Yehovah, however it's articulated. And of course, this wonderful, detailed, vegetal and floral kind of minutely detailed, but infinitizing in its qualities kind of element. But the hands are also doubling up what sometimes appears as a single hand. So I'm looking here from Morocco at a synagogue lamp from the late 19th century that is being held up by a hand. The hand in the Jewish context, because of its 5 fingers, would stand, of course, for the 5 books of the Torah. If it were a Christian context, it would be the 5 wounds into Christ's body. In the Muslim context, which is where this 5-fingered hand most frequently appears in the course of the medieval and following periods, the khamsa, from the Arabic word for 5, of course, stands for the 5 pillars of Islam, and also stands for the relationship between God and ourselves, where the 4 fingers represent our 4-directioned reality, and the thumb that is both separate from and connected to them is the one God, separate from and connected to us. But the idea of a lamp that in any case stands for God's eternal presence before the Holy Ark in the synagogue is one picked up and finds its way into the mosque as well. So you have a magnificent development of mosque lamps within the Muslim tradition that reflect a phrase in the Quran, chapter 24, verse 35, that likens God to a kind of light, as it were, in a glass lamp, as it were, within the world as a niche, and the niche would be the mihrab. So the prayer niche or mihrab in the mosque emulates the Torah niche or Aron HaKodesh in the synagogue, connects to the idea of the apse in the church, all of which are orienting you to the place on the planet where you can have the most direct connection to God. So for Jews, it's Jerusalem, theoretically. It becomes east, even when I'm up in Russia and Jerusalem isn't actually to the east from me any longer. In Christianity, it becomes more complicated both by the advent of Rome as the New Jerusalem and by the dissemination of different forms of Christian faith. For Islam, it starts out toward Jerusalem, but in the midst of Muhammad's preachership, around 624-5 or possibly 627-8, he redirects the Qibla, the orientation of Islam, towards Mecca. And so this mihrab, which comes from the 10th century in Cordoba, is facing towards Mecca. So as a Muslim, if I'm praying towards this mihrab, I'm praying towards Mecca, but I'm reminded of Jerusalem because I've got the pair of columns which stand for Jerusalem. I also have this wonderful play. There are 5 of these. You can only see a couple of them here inside the niche. There's a separation of the lower from the upper part by an inscription that comes from the Quran. And then you have these wonderful, no 2 of them exactly alike, infinitizing series of patterns, all of them finitized as well. 19 of them. The first verse of the Quran is made up of 19 Arabic letters. In Quran 78, verse 30, 19 angels guard hell. In verse 19 of chapter 19, Jesus, the son of Mary, is first mentioned in the Quran. So 19ness has all kinds of implications for Islam. So I can't always be in a mosque 5 times a day, 7 days a week to pray. So sometimes I have to find a place where I can pray. And when I pray in Islam, I don't just stand, I go down on my knees. I put my forehead to the ground. I do this multiple times. One of the developments in the 15th and 16th centuries in Ottoman Turkey is the prayer rug, such as you see exemplified here. Sejada is what it's called in Turkish. And this one dates from the time of Suleiman the Magnificent. It's about 1525 or so. And what you can see we have in this prayer rug is the mihrab, is the pair of columns, is the mosque lamp, all of it emulated. So I'm literally praying into it. By the way, flanked by this kind of leaves. It's from what in Turkish is called saj. It's a saj garden. It's a paradise. It's a garden of paradise. And there are 7 of these rows because heaven has 7 elements to it. There are 7 layers to heaven. It looks like we have another one here, except look again. This is a Hebrew inscription. This is the gate to the Lord, the righteous shall enter here. And we realize it's a Torah, it's a synagogue curtain done in Cairo in the 17th century, both almost certainly by a Muslim craftsman for a synagogue. And that's probably why the calligraphy is not so carefully done, but also with all of the elements that make it look like a prayer rug, from the columns to the rows to this interesting goblet with its 9 hanging lamps, 9 in Kabbalah, the number of truth. You take any number, any threefold number, add up those 3 numbers, take 14 from them, and what you're left with, add them up, and it will come to 9, regardless of the number. There are a number of other reasons. The word Adam in Hebrew, 3 letters, Aleph, Dalet, Mem, 1, 4, 40, therefore 4, gives you 9, and so on and so forth. All these kinds of important reasons, aside from much later on, the idea of Hanukkah and the Chanukiah and all of that biz. The point is, we see again and again these kinds of interweaves among the traditions. The Sultan, of course, is the one who protects us from our enemies. There's only one of him. So he's a little bit like the one God against our enemies. And what you're looking at here is part of the sword. It's a ceremonial sword called in Turkish a yatayan. And the Sultan is symbolized here by this bird that looks kind of like a phoenix. It would be called a senmurv in Turkish. It would be called a simurg in Persian. There's only one of them. It lives for 1,000 years. It steps onto its own, it creates its own, funerary place, and it rises from the ashes again. And it's shown here with a garden that comes out of its own tail against the symbol of the negative opposite, which in this case is a dragon. A dragon which starts in China as a good luck symbol and works its way over to the Middle East and into Europe, where it ultimately becomes a symbol, particularly within Christianity, of the serpent, the dragon in the garden, in the book of Revelation, of the opposer, of the Satan, and that idea will be picked up in the imagery of Islam, as for example in this case. Of course, the Sultan is most frequently represented by the special kind of signature that he develops. It's called a Tura, which is part and parcel of the inclination within Muslim art to use writing itself as a work of art. So you have 6 major calligraphic styles and another 12.5 subsets of them, and that in and of itself becomes a way of creating art that doesn't involve figures. Because like Judaism, Islam is a bit uncomfortable with figures. It doesn't mean that we don't got figures here. So here you have, for example, Mehmed Fatih, Mehmed the Conqueror, Mehmed II. He's the dude who finally conquered Constantinople, because of whom eventually it became the capital of the Ottoman Empire, known otherwise as Istanbul. Interestingly, the idea of figurative painting and of painting of sultans was learned from the Venetians, specifically Gentile Bellini. Spent half a year in Istanbul teaching the Ottomans about this, just as he brought back from Ottoman Turkey things like the marbling of paper. But also interesting, this is Mehmed the Conqueror, and yet the way he wants to have himself represented is not with the sword, but with the flower, to show that other side of him. But the fact of the matter is, Islamic art does not necessarily not even represent Muhammad. We see him here in the late 16th century Safavid manuscript illumination on the way to Mecca with Abu Bakr and Ali. Of course, his face is covered. However, from a slightly different locale, slightly earlier image, we see the Prophet himself with his face uncovered, with an enormous halo rising from him on the back of the talking steed Burak. Not in the Quran, but in the Hadith, we read about how what is mentioned in one verse, the first verse of the 17th chapter of the Quran as the night journey, was in fact an elaborate journey that took the prophet from Mecca to Jerusalem, up to the throne of heaven, back to Jerusalem, back to Mecca in a single night. So we're seeing him here led by the angel Gabriel, amongst these clouds with this talking steed Burak. And on the way up, he is meeting Enoch and Abraham and Jacob and Jesus, among others, so that we see actually figurative representation, which leads me to one last quick question with an answer. So what happens to all of this when we get into the 19th and 20th centuries in the West, when we don't do this stuff anymore, because we're becoming more secular, we're becoming more mechanistic. We no longer necessarily believe in that kind of God, or in there is a God at all, or whatever. And yet we find that this sensibility does not drain out of us, and its expression visually just takes new forms. No one could be more secular than the artist Paul Gauguin, but interestingly, he's absolutely passionately interested in human spirituality. This is an image that he did at the end of the 1880s out in Brittany, of these very pious Britain women. It's called after the sermon. They've come out of church, they've heard this sermon that was obviously incredibly inspiring about Jacob wrestling the angel. So much so that when they come out of the church, we're looking over their shoulders and we're seeing what they're seeing with their eyes closed, their inner vision. The wrestling match is taking place on a lawn which is not green, it's red, the color of passion. And notice the way this wonderful tree separates the profane world of these people and the cows strolling across it from the sacred vision they're happening. Fast forward to 1987, and under Serrano's famous Piss Christ that pissed so many people off, because they didn't understand what he was doing, he took a plastic image of the crucified Christ and submerged it in a vat of his own urine and then photographed it. He wasn't being sacrilegious. He is an observant Catholic. If I'm going to humanize Christ, then let's be real. He pees, he bleeds, he drank his mother's milk, and so he did a series of these, submerged in blood, submerged in milk, submerged in urine. That's what he's about. And of course, if I don't know the backstory, all I'm seeing is this extraordinary, wonderfully golden crucified Christ. What about Modigliani, who in 1917, this very, very secular Jewish artist, mainly known for his portraiture, does one of the four, that's all we've got, landscapes he's done. He knows he's dying. He's back in the south of France. It's as close as he'll ever get to Italy again, whence he came. And it's just called the Paysage du Midi, the landscape of the south. He's followed a very Cézannesque kind of stylistic canon where the canvas is shining through. And you've got the road leading into the distance. You've got the trees, but it's one tree. But look at it, looks like a menorah tree. The two limbs that have leaves that looks like candle bursts. I'm not saying he sat down and said, I'm going to paint me a menorah tree. I'm saying what came out of his unconscious as he thinks back to the childhood that he left behind, this warm Italian Jewish childhood, was this kind of an image. Jacques Lifshitz from Lithuania, a decade later, does this quasi-cubist work called Pierrot Escaping. Pierrot is the clown who weeps while he's making us laugh. And of course, he looks like a Star of David. He can't escape. He can't escape because the same bronze that is behind him is in front of him. The ladder goes from nowhere to nowhere. Behind him is a series of 4 crosses. You cannot escape being a Jew just by converting, just by becoming some other kind of Jew. And of course, this is 1926-27. Hitler is already on the move. With another 6 or 7 years, he's going to become the Chancellor of Germany, and we know where that leads. Among the places it leads to is Kristallnacht in 1938. And this is a painting by Marc Chagall called White Crucifixion, painted that year. The most Christian of symbols. And yet he's wearing a Jewish prayer cloth, a talit, as a loincloth. We've got not angels, but Jewish elders hovering over him. We've got all of these scenes of destruction, and I'll call to your attention just 2 elements here. One is the 7-branched menorah, but count them. No 7, only 6. Where is that sabbatical, that salvational 7? It's missing. The only place that's empty is where the ladder is. That's the ladder on which Nicodemus or St. Joseph of Arimathea would be standing to lovingly and gently take the body of Christ down from the cross. There is no savior for the Savior. There's no salvation. He is nothing but a suffering Jew. So he's transformed this symbol into something very different. Just a few last images. What about the aftermath of that? What about abstraction? Jackson Pollock, renowned for these explosive paintings that everyone said, oh, it's all about form, nothing about content. Huge paintings, no frames to separate it from what's outside. And you're telling me that all of a sudden in art, an artist is not responding to the explosion of the world, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Terezin, Auschwitz, pick your time, pick your place. The abstract expressionists like Pollock are responding to the world of explosion by exploding on their canvases. And on the other hand, the chromaticists like Mark Rothko, Barnett Newman, Adolf Gottlieb, all who happen to be Jewish, all who happen to be talking about the idea of repairing the world. Tikkun Olam, as associated with the 17th century Kabbalist Luria, and asking the question, where do we fit in as Jews to Western art, which has been so long Christian? They're putting the world back together again. Your eye is drawn toward the center of this image from which light is emulating. Muslim artists, this is Charles Hussein Zendarudi from Iran, and it's called The Hand. On the one hand, this is the baptismal bowl, this is the six-pointed star, this is the khamsa. On the other hand, this is the hand of Hazrat Abbas, whom every Iranian would know as the grandson of Ali, who was defeated by the Sunnis and whose hands were chopped off, and he was carrying water from the river to his troops. Even in that case, this is the Battle of Karbala in 680, the consummate hero for Iran. Mona Hatoum, a Lebanese of Palestinian extraction living in London, does this thing that's called the garden. On the one hand, it grows, it's constantly changing before your very eyes. On the other hand, it looks like sandbags, which you use in military context. On the third hand, it is, after all, a wall that separates you on this side from that side of the gallery. This is Israel-Palestine. On the fourth hand, the hard-hanging gardens of Babylon have become revisioned a different way. And one last image by Siona Benjamin, born in Mumbai, Jewish. All her friends are Hindus and Muslims. She goes to Catholic and Zoroastrian schools. Eventually, she comes to study art in America. They're saying, you got to do abstract expressionism. You got to do abstract expressionism. She finds her own vocabulary by the 90s. And this is one of a long series called Finding Home, in which we have herself, really, but also as a kind of Shiva Nataraj dancing on the lotus. Her arms become a seven-branched candelabrum, yielding a series of seven khamsas, yielding a series of seven flames that are stylized homes, and written on this canvas in Hebrew, repairing the world, Tikkun Olam. In Devanagari, it's the writing, but it's not the language. It's not Hindi or Urdu, it's Hebrew, but in Devanagari, it says the same thing, Tikkun HaOlam. In other words, the different worlds of which she is part, and not just the Abrahamic traditions, but the Dharmic traditions as well, all become part of her project as an artist of trying to make the world a better place. And I went on for too long, I'm sorry, but I'm done. Any quick question?
Ori, thank you so much for that amazing tour of three traditions, and then actually more traditions right at the end into a kind of universal space. I think we probably don't have time for questions, but unless Teo, we can go over time a bit. Is that possible? Okay, looks like we can. I won't take up
yes.
I won't take up time with my own question. I'll just note that as you were talking, I was thinking about Jung and his idea of the collective unconscious and symbols of transformation and archetypes, and it would be lovely to have a conversation about that at some point. But
I saw there was an origin of the six-pointed star question that was asked by Nissan, and the answer is the triangle up, the triangle down. So opposites meeting, the male phallus stylized, the female pubis stylized. So male, female as stand-ins, symbols of heaven and earth, divine, human. So an old, a pagan symbol in fact, Thea, I believe the earliest example of it is on a ring from Georgia that's thousands and thousands of years old. And it gets picked up eventually within all three Abrahamic traditions. And it's not until the late 16th, early 17th century that it starts to be used in Central Europe as a particularly Jewish symbol. And then by the end of the 19th century, it becomes associated with Jewish nationalism. So it comes to be thunk of as the consummate Jewish symbol, the equivalent of the cross to Christianity, or the crescent, which is a relatively late arrival into Islam as well. But its history goes way, 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 way back and precedes any of the Abrahamic traditions.
Thank you. Are there any final questions that anybody would like to ask? Indeed. We should probably stop there, as it's meant to be an hour's meeting. Thank you again for a wonderful talk, which took us on a journey right across civilization almost. Yes, and do show your appreciation either digitally or by waving. Thank you very much, Professor Soltes.
I very much appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Good evening, or good whatever part time of day it is for you. Goodbye.